Hello, everyone. My name's Andrea Edwards, and this is the beginning of part 2 of We Need a New Middle Class Dream. I want to say thank you to everyone who spent the time watching part 1. I know it's long, and people still tell me it's long, even though all the way through I did explain why it needs to be long. What we're dealing with is an incredibly complex situation, and it needs our time and attention to ensure that we're doing what we need to do. The things that matter require our attention. We're so distracted by shiny things. It's really, really something that drives me, and I know many other people, crazy. So what I'm trying to illustrate here is the scale of the issue that we face. And it's something that I'm not seeing discussed a lot. And that's why I've decided to put all this work into pulling this together. So let's get stuck into the first section of part 2 of We Need a New Middle Class Dream. All right, like I said, welcome back to part 2 of We Need a New Middle Class Dream. And the way I'm going to make it shorter is by doing this in sections. So I've broken my leg, so I'm trying to make myself comfortable. All right, so I'm back up here. I've tried to adjust all of the slides so that this little window doesn't interfere with them. I moved the window last time, but with Zoom, it stays in the same place. So what I'm going to do is chop this into multiple sections. So I'll release videos over the coming weeks. And today what we're going to do is we're going to focus on population and how quickly it's grown, emissions right across the board, and then we're going to start getting specific. And today it's going to be about homes and personal transportation. All right. So in part 1, we discussed that today we officially have 3.8 billion middle-class people, and that number is expected to grow to 4.8 billion by 2030. What this means is we have 50% of the world's population now considered middle class, and that next billion, which is due by 2030, are obviously already buying more and living better lives, which I said in the first one, I don't blame them for. Being middle class means you have money to spend on necessities and potentially luxuries. It's also the largest spending group in the world, sitting in the driver's seat for increased consumption of goods and materials. 50 years ago, this group was almost exclusively in the West. Today, it is increasingly spread around the world, especially in Asia Pacific. Part 1, we also looked at the spending power of both the upper middle class and the middle class. So in 2020, it was $44 trillion. It's expected to grow to 62 trillion by 2030. And this is 41% growth this decade. Just an important reminder, the global economy was worth 105 trillion in 2023. Growth is the problem, and the scale of humans who can afford to consume is the problem. We talked about it in part 1. The billionaires have individual emissions the size of countries. We absolutely need to tackle that excess, as well as the upper middle class, which is where the millionaires and multimillionaires are sitting. They're the first people that need to act, and they need to scale it down. But the problem is much bigger, and that was basically what I was sort of making the case for in part 1. So let's get into section 3, growth, challenges, and solutions. So in this section, I'm aiming to help everyone understand the explosive growth in the last couple of decades across multiple industries where we are consuming in bigger and bigger numbers. I think it's really, really critical that we grasp the size of the challenge, because that's also the solution. All right, let's start with population growth. So in 2022, as I'm sure you all know, we passed the 8 billion mark for human population. And all we have to do is look at how rapid this growth has been over an incredibly short period of time, especially when you look at it from a geological perspective. So this graph goes back 12,000 years, which is when we came out of the last ice age. And it's obvious the moment fossil fuels were added into the mix. That's the point where it just goes straight up. To summarize what you can see here, we had a total human population of 600 million people in the year 1700. 990 million people in the years 1800, 1.65 billion in 1900, and by the end of the 90s, so 1999, we're at 6 billion. And of course, today, as I said, we're past 8 billion, with nearly half defined as middle class. One other issue that is here, sort of down the bottom right, which we don't talk about enough, is the change in life expectancy. Life expectancy was less than 30 years before 1800, and in 2023, it has risen to 73 years of age. So not only do we have many more people, we also have many more people living much longer, and that, of course, adds to the challenge. There's a lot of conversation about how many people are in the world, and I call it the peak of humanity. So have we hit peak human? Some experts expect the number of humans to crash once we hit 9 billion, and others are saying it's going to start happening at 11 billion. But there are other factors at play here, especially male infertility, which is expected to reach a catastrophic crash by 2060. And this is all due to the chemicals and plastics in our environment, which of course doesn't just impact humans, it impacts all life on Earth, but the same impacts will be felt by the animals in our environment. So the ramifications of novel entities is really starting to be understood now. And it was a very slow going process trying to get any data to prove that all the chemicals and the plastics in our environment were doing a lot of harm. Well, now they're starting to see it, especially in sperm counts in men. So we've got a lot of work to do to clean up the environment, that's for sure. So essentially, we are already well on the path for a huge population adjustment, with scientists saying we shouldn't have more than 1 billion humans if we want a healthy Earth. But others are suggesting the human population should be as low as 500 million. So that's a big change from where we are today at 8 billion. Regardless of how many of us there are, the critical piece is how we live and consume on this planet. That's the issue, overshoot, which we talked a lot about in part 1. And that's all about us taking far too much from our Earth. We have to bring our consumption down. Now, if you look at the cumulative CO2 emissions since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, the path upwards is the same. Now, if this graph went back 12,000 years, like the population graph did, the curve up would be a straight line like we just saw in the population graph. But let's measure growth from 1950 to today. Cumulative emissions were at 200 billion in 1950, and by the 2020s, it was approximately 1.7 trillion. That represents 750% growth over a 70-year period. Where all of the growth is coming from, so electricity and heat, which you can see is at the very, very top, and it's off the charts compared to the rest, and that's just for that sector alone, that's growth of 76%, which is almost 3 times the growth since 1990. Transport, manufacturing and construction, and agriculture come in 2nd, 3rd, and 4th place. So they're the next 3 high growth areas for emissions increases. Just before we move on, if you want to get a sense of how we're going, particularly if we link it to the major global climate event that gets all of the attention, well, here we go. I'd suggest it's not very promising in that we're not making a lot of progress. I hope you agree with me. Okay, so how does this translate to us and how we all live our lives? In the coming videos, I'll lay this all out, and I'm going to be very data heavy on purpose because there are people that need data and there are people that don't. And I'm attempting to capture both sides because I think it's really important. But I wanted to start with 2, our homes and personal transport options. So a home is obviously the starting point for middle class spending power. All over the world, we're hearing of housing shortages in developed countries, the unaffordability of entering the housing market. And of course, we have record numbers of people living rough all the way through to being forced into refugee camps, including displaced persons camps in country, which is not just happening in developing countries, it's happening in developed or wealthy countries too. The biggest issue with homes is the massive growth of the human population. In the UK alone, if we built all the homes necessary to meet the needs of its citizens, just that would exceed its annual emissions targets. So that means we've got a bit of a problem. As we discussed earlier, we had a population of 4 billion in 1974, and we've added the next billion just over a decade, every decade since then. That increase is going to drive massive growth, extraction from nature, and create a surge in emissions. So this is really critical that we get this right. Here's a look at global construction growth predictions, and this covers China, the US, India, which has huge growth predictions, closely followed by Indonesia, that looks like it wants to grow too. Japan is obviously much lower. The UK, Germany, and Australia are all included there. Overall growth in the construction field is expected at 35% over the next 10 years. Construction isn't just residential, of course. We have office and factory construction, utilities, and more. So, what materials are used in construction? I know some people know this stuff, but most of us don't. So here's information according to VEA Constructions. The 10 basic building materials are steel, wood, soil, rubble, sand, bricks, cement, water, aggregates, and pea sand. In case you don't know, and I didn't before I saw this, pea sand is good for plastering walls and brickwork, whereas sand is used for concrete or mortar mix. However, growth means we need more of all of these, but can nature accommodate growth in all these areas and not be in overshoot? The obvious answer is no. And while we're hearing some positives, green steel and green cement, it's not happening anywhere near at scale, and it's also not that affordable. So we really need to be rethinking this all. The challenge we have is over extraction. And just to give you one example, sand is one of the resources at risk. Now, when I first learnt about this a few years ago, I'm like, how the hell can we run out of sand? Well, we can, and we are. So that's a problem. It's a core element in our construction needs, and we're running out of sand. One area we really need to be looking at seriously investing in is sustainable building materials. Both hemp and bamboo are rapidly growing plants. They are incredibly successful at sequestering CO2, and they are abundant and easy to use. Let's push for our homes and the infrastructure in our communities to be built with sustainable materials. And if hemp or bamboo isn't on the agenda, let's make sure we get it there. Of course, when it comes to our homes, all the stuff we put inside matters too. And I'll talk about white goods separately because it definitely needs a separate section. But here's global furniture predictions growing at 42% this decade, which is nearly double. So I'm in Phuket, and just in the area I live, 16,000 new homes are being built at the moment. And the impact of this building frenzy is crazy for the entire community. The roads are full of construction trucks that you can see the damage. I mean, they're chopping down forests to build these things, which means CO2 is being released from the earth, and it's just crazy. But then we've got to furnish them, not just build them, then they've got to be furnished, and you can imagine the ramifications of that. So this chart, it obviously includes all furniture, including fast furniture, and that is essentially low quality furniture that doesn't last. And that's something we have fallen in love with over the recent decades. But honestly, fast furniture is definitely one of those industries we need to consider cancelling. Deforestation, plastics, just poor quality. So it needs to be replaced over and over again, which adds to our consumption records. Quality products that last is what we need. You know, the sort of furniture that used to be handed down from generation to generation. Problem is today, because of the fast and furious emergence of fast furniture, we put a lot of the master craftsmen out of work. So we've lost the skills, and that's a real problem. And we need to work out how we can get that back. So what can we do about it? You know, what are our options here? And I'm presenting all of these as ideas. I'm not saying this is what we have to do, but we do need to be making some radical changes in our lives. And the people with the most are the people that need to do the most here. And while you're not necessarily going to appreciate what I'm sharing, I just want to ask everyone to keep an open mind. All right, let's start with rentals. So we need landlords and we need a rental property market, an effective one. And I know that landlords often get depicted in a negative light, but you know, there are people who can't buy a home, and there's also people who don't want to buy a home. And I'm one of those people. I don't want to buy a home. It doesn't make any sense at all based on what I'm seeing that's happening in the world. I wouldn't even know where I could buy a property at the moment. But what landlords need to do today is they need to ensure that their homes, their investments are ready for the environment on the way, like preparing for heat, cold, grid failures, floods, fires, and all of the other extreme events that are happening around the world. Number two, should we still be accepting holiday homes as something that's acceptable within our societies, especially if they're only used once or twice a year? So we've got to ask ourselves, is this a sort of a mindset that we really need to be thinking about changing? So many people can't access homes, families included. So is it right that we continue with this in light of the challenging years and decades that we have ahead? If we want to get our emissions down, we've got to stop building new homes. But if we stop building new homes, how do we help the people who aren't currently on the property ladder? But it's a really important consideration. And you'll see here Airbnbs, and again, this will be unpopular, but I think it's well overdue that we reconsider Airbnbs. If you're paying attention and not just enjoying the convenience of Airbnbs, I've only stayed in a few, I'm not really a big fan, but you'll know that these rentals are destroying the fabrics of societies around the world, especially where they exist in large numbers. So cities like Amsterdam have really lost their soul because the local people have to move out because they can't afford to live in the city anymore because of Airbnbs. Now, I know that there are people who rely on the income of Airbnbs during this cost of living crisis, and maybe we can say to them, you keep going, right? It's an income you need. But the Airbnbs where people own multiple properties, you know, ancient cities in Europe like Italy just has started talking about the over-tourism problem, and Airbnb is part of that. You know, maybe, you know, just because you have wealth doesn't mean it gives you the right to do this. From an environment perspective, from a social perspective, you know, we've got to bring our cities and our communities back together. And if what we're doing is breaking them apart, then I think that we definitely have a problem. So we've got to start thinking about homes in the climate that we have, but we've also got to start thinking about homes in the climate that we want to create for the future, for future generations. But actually, it's also for ourselves. It's getting hotter and hotter now. We can't keep looking at releasing more emissions. All right. This is something else that is very, very delicate, of course. People are very attached to their homes, especially the elderly. They've raised their families in their homes. There's a lot of memories in their homes, and I very much understand this. And I'm not being horrible here by suggesting it, but is it time that we really looked to move the elderly out of family homes into smaller homes that are beautiful and appealing and will make them happy? We have so many families needing homes, so the logical place to start is to focus on existing family homes where only one or two people continue to live. Like I said, I know this is hard, but we have to make dramatic changes in all of our lives if we want to tackle the challenges that we face. So, but we've got to get this right. You know, you think about it, when you're young, you grow up in your family home, and then you move to the city and you live in the inner city with your friends in small apartments. And then when you have families, you go out to your family homes. And it's that next step afterwards that I don't think we've really considered. And I think that we do need to consider, especially in the wealthy Western nations where we've got these massive boomer populations. What can we do for them? So none of that's been thought through, even though we always knew this huge demographic was going to move into old age. We haven't looked at their healthcare. We haven't looked at the way they live. We haven't looked at anything. And that's a failure of government. But one of the things we can do is, how do we address housing so we're maximizing the properties we already have without having to build more homes, which are going to create more problems for all of us? All right. Is it time to focus on community living now? If you talk about living together with your families, this could be, of course, incredibly unpopular, but you can also bring communities of friends together and build a sustainable community where you have your gardens and you compost together and you do everything together, right? So it doesn't have to be a bad thing. Large parts of the world already do this. Multi-generational living has not gone away in basically in the global south. It has not gone away. And if we focus on multi-generational living, then less homes will need to be built. All right, number 5, how can we create homes from existing infrastructure, factories, office buildings, old railway stations, whatever it is, right? We've got to focus on building with what we have, not clearing more land so we can have more homes. We need to build up, not out. And I know that this isn't very appealing for people who've had the opportunity to only live in homes in their lives. But if you look at countries like Singapore, this is a whole country that is built on a tiny piece of land, but everyone has a home and is able to afford a home in Singapore. Number 7, we need to shrink our living spaces, and the constant need for more, bigger, that needs to be a thing of the past. I read an article in Time magazine probably about 12 months ago or so, and it suggested that we all need 20 meters squared of living space each. I'm going to do a video of how big 20 meters squared is so you can get a sense of that. And so in this article, they were saying if we get to a population of 11 billion, if we focus on everyone only having 20 meters squared of living space, we could probably do that. So is that something that we could do and be open to discussing and thinking about? And number 8, how are we going to get ready for the climate refugees? We already have a massive issue here, and it's going to get worse. Surely it's time we look to solve this. Just one idea. Could we look at moving the refugees around the world who are living in terrible situations, and when the heat comes through into these refugee camps, it's going to be an absolute disaster based on how they're living. But could we look at identifying parts of the world where we know that we're going to be able to build future cities because of ice melt and all that stuff that's coming our way? But could we get them to move there now and start building those future cities? We need to be looking at doing some pretty radical things, so why not? But the other thing to remember is that any single one of us could be climate refugees. My home country, Australia, is considered on the front line of becoming unlivable because it's so dry and so hot. And we're seeing the incredible heat waves that are coming across Australia this year. Perth, up around 50 degrees at the moment. So when I grew up, we might have passed 40 degrees sometimes, but the idea of 50 degrees, thankfully the grid is still holding, so people aren't dying in massive numbers when the grid goes down and they can't cool their homes. So we've got to be doing radical things. All right, let's get on to rethinking homes. And this is some really specific things for all of us to be thinking about. So individually, we've all got to understand the risks we face wherever we live in the world. If you do nothing else, at least understand that the risks you face, and I know a lot of people don't want to do this, but, it's not just environmental risks, it's also finance, including mortgages and insurance. How many parts of the world have we seen where the insurance companies are either doubling their premiums or more, or they're moving out of areas altogether like Florida and California, right? So insurance is important, and also understanding the livability of where you live in the short-term future. So if you're living in a floodplain and you've been flooded in the past, and for every degree of global warming, we know that there's going to be 7% more moisture in the atmosphere, then the chances of you being flooded again and again are getting higher and higher. So what are you going to do about that? How are you going to prepare for that? I know these are big questions that we've got to be asking ourselves, but this is where we are right now. So, what can you do today? What should you invest in to ensure your family is safe? And are you living in an environment or in an area where climate impacts will destroy your property's value? You hear people in Florida, they're saying, well, we don't care. We can afford it. But can you afford it if your property gets destroyed or its value gets destroyed? And if not, what are you going to do about it? And this is where we are. So understanding before the crisis hits. If there's one thing I advise everyone I know, you've got to understand the risks where you live and work out what you must do about it. And the longer you wait, the worse it's going to be. Because if other people get in ahead of you, the early actors will benefit the most. The longer you wait, the worse it's going to be. I think something that I really want to emphasize is no one's going to come and save any of us wherever we are. The billion-dollar climate impacts are happening over shorter and shorter periods. As these crises escalate, there's going to be less and less money. So for the people in the poorest parts of the world, all the way through to the people in the wealthiest parts of the world, this is really a time where you've got to be resilient, but you've also got to be independent and make sure that you're taking care of yourself and your families. All right, number 2, we need to make sure that we are designing and building homes compatible with a healthy planet and appropriate for where we live based on the environment we have coming. How do we design our homes so everyone can be comfortable and appropriately housed without creating even more destruction? In too many countries, the leaders are demonstrating no long-term thinking. Instead, short-term profits are prioritized, which means the people will suffer as a result with poorly built homes that are not built for the current climate, let alone what is to come. Number 3, how can we build our future cities and towns so 8.1 billion and a growing population can live in safety and dignity, including the refugees, which will continue to grow, as well as the record number of displaced people. Number 4, of course, we also need to rethink what's in the home. Fast furniture is a no. Quality that lasts is a yes. The truth is we've just got to shrink it all down. We need to buy less and work out what we can share, which is also called the sharing economy. Vehicles, white goods, tools we only use a couple of times a year. Do we really all need to own them? So that's a mindset shift that we need to make. All right, let's move on to cars and motorbikes, which is obviously another big ticket item for the middle class. So my family always had one car when we grew up. It wasn't a particularly spectacular car. But in the mid-80s, we got a second car for my mum. Not long after that, my older brother got his first car. From 1 car to 3 in a matter of years, and we weren't even middle class. The big difference is at the time, Australia had a population of about 16 million people. So no big deal, right? Well, now we're at 3.8 billion middle-class people and a global population of 8.1 billion people. So today it is a big deal having 3 cars. To give you some numbers, in the world right now, we have nearly 1.5 billion cars and 19% of them are in the United States. Motorbikes, we have anywhere between 600 million to 1 billion. And I live in the land of motorbikes, and let me assure you that there are a lot of them. And of course, they create emissions too. Adding both together, that means at the extreme end, we have nearly 2.5 billion vehicles today emitting CO2. It's a problem, and it's only growing because in the global south, where the majority of the world's population lives and the largest chunk of the new middle class exists, advertising for the latest cars and bikes is omnipresent. Trust me, it is overwhelming. It is all push, 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 buy, cars, bikes, loans, financing, you name it. So I'll give you one example of vehicle growth just in Asia. So in Malaysia, according to official data, between July 1995 to May 2023, Malaysia vehicles sales growth was an average of 6.9%. That's a respectable amount of growth rate, yeah? But when you all add it up, that's 548% total growth over 28 years. And these are the sort of numbers that I don't think we spend enough time looking at, the cumulative growth over the longer term, rather than that small incremental growth that we see year by year. Obviously, I'm not picking on Malaysia. These sorts of numbers are in every country. The point is growth is the problem. Of course, we must recognize some people will still need cars, but we need to redesign how we live so that individual vehicles become a thing of the past, and EVs are included in that. We need to rethink everywhere. To give you some research data on growth, just in worldwide motor vehicle production, we went from 58 million in the year 2000 to 85 million today, and that's almost double the growth at 47%. Although one has to wonder what that growth would have looked like if we didn't experience the pandemic. And then we have the explosive growth of SUVs, which are deadly in an urban environment, especially for children. And as we can see here, SUVs have grown by about 20% in 2010 to 50% in 2022. And I know these numbers are growing even more. I'm hearing in Australia, in the US, SUVs are the hot ticket item when it comes to buying a new car. But because of the higher emissions released by SUVs, we are cancelling out any benefits we could have gained. So please don't buy a car, or if you do, small, medium, or an EV. We must also understand how toxic cars are beyond tailpipe emissions. And I found this a really interesting little cartoon. As you can see, the only benefit of EVs is really the tailpipe emissions. Otherwise, roadkill in nature, or local pets, or even people. But it's also the mining of the metals, the plastics in the cars. But a big thing that's really, really come through, it was recently announced that the highest amount of plastic pollution in our oceans is from tire dust. With EVs, it's even worse because the cars are so much heavier. These microplastics released by our tires are highly toxic, and beyond the impact it has in our oceans, which is already bad enough, let's remember that the poorest neighborhoods all over the world are where the major roads and highways are built. I was kind of relieved to see this new report. So basically, a damning new report was how it was positioned, has found legacy car companies are significantly underestimating the lifetime emissions of their ICE, which stands for internal combustion engine vehicles, and that investments in car makers are, on average, more carbon intensive than investments in oil companies. Now, this is really interesting, right? So in the 50s, 60s, 70s, when the fossil fuel industry went out and did the science and understood that they were creating a problem that was going to get bigger over time, they also recruited multiple industries, and one of those industries was the automotive industry. But as we've seen, they don't get a lot of negative media coverage, and they are committed to their growth at all costs. And if you live in the global south, you'll know that you've seen it too, but it's all over the world, right? So while we're seeing EVs taking off everywhere, the growth of the automotive industry has not slowed down at all. I'm pleased to see these guys starting to get the attention in the media, because There just really isn't enough conversation around the impact of this industry and how disastrous it is for the environment. We need to get cars off the road. That's the important thing. All right, let's look at rethinking transportation. And to me, this is a slightly more obvious one than homes, which has so many more aspects to it. But we've got to start to acknowledge that individual transport, while lovely for those of us who can afford it, but it's an absolute disaster for our environment on multiple levels. So do we just continue? Do we continue to allow the industry to grow? Do we accept that growth? Or are we all ready to come together and drive massive changes in our societies? So the easiest place to start, I think, and this is something I ask a lot of people, can you get rid of your car? Do you really need one? Like really, really need one? And can you fight for better public transportation wherever you are? Because that needs to be happening at the same time. We need to be looking at building the sharing economy where we share assets like cars rather than all feeling that we need to own them individually. We can develop technology applications easily where we can have a pool of cars that a community shares and you book it in advance. Why not? You know, those sort of things that we need to do. We're at the point where we need to be scaling down cars in all ways, everywhere. We need to rip up the tarmac and make it green because the urban heat island effect is going to become an even more serious issue in the coming years, with extreme events happening more regularly and lasting longer. So because of our cities, because we have so much cement and so much tarmac in our cities, they're making our cities hotter. So the idea is we get rid of it wherever we can. We rip it up and make it green. That's got to be a critical part of the move forward, or we're not going to be successful. Obviously, to achieve this, we need effective public transportation and infrastructure to move people around. The problem is our governments have gone the other way and continue to go the other way. We've got areas like Europe who are investing in their train infrastructure again. We're seeing some areas of Asia, even I saw the other day that the US is building new train tracks. But the privatization of any transport, especially trains, is something that we need to be forcing our governments to reverse, and it needs to be cheaper and more convenient than driving or flying. So we need to get out of the cars and all fossil fuel vehicles, but EVs aren't the answer either, especially not as a replacement. Number 6, and as I shared earlier, tailpipe emissions are not the only issue. 50% of plastic waste in the ocean is now thought to be from tire dust. It's a highly toxic pollutant going into our environment all over the world. All right, so as I go through this series, I'm going to be asking you, what's your plan? What's your ideas? What can we do to come together and ensure a collective future? So talking about cars, right? I'm living in a place where it's impossible for me not to have a car. Impossible. There is no infrastructure in place for any sort of public transportation. So I do have a car. So I'm not shaming anyone who's got a car. I know I grew up in Australia, big countries like Australia and America. The cars are really important, and our entire lives have been designed around cars, right? So that's a real problem. But if I was designing cities today, I'd rip up the roads, especially in residential areas, and I would plant trees and food in its place while ensuring we leave enough space for bikes, scooters, walking paths so people can get around. But then on the main roads left behind, because you've got to have some roads for transportation to get around, why not have a pool of electric vehicles driving the area, picking up people and taking them to the local shopping centre, you know, so take the elderly to the shopping centre, or taking them to emissions-free central transportation depots. But of course, for this to be done, it's got to be brilliant, which means it has to be clean, safe, which is incredibly important, and very, very efficient as well as cost effective. So that's just one idea that I sort of play around with in my mind. I don't have any power to make that happen other than to share it as an idea. But to the city planners, you know, the urban heat island effect is huge. Let's get the roads up. Let's put the green in. You know, that's what it's all about. Okay, we've done homes and personal transport today. And next time we're going to do food, which includes, of course, fast food. So come back and check out that one. I'll see you soon.
I'm coming